So the topic, I guess, I've been uploading some videos, some commentary on people like Academic Agent, Carl Benjamin, who used to be called Sargon of Akkad, and the kind of traditionalist, this used to be called the alt-right in the US. And the names change, now it became the dissonant right, America First, MAGA, and now it's back to America First because they don't like MAGA anymore, right? They don't, Trump is going out of favor with this crowd, and so. What do you call these people? But anyway, Nick Fuentes is the main, person that I'm addressing because there was a moment in time when Trump was elected, and there was the whole issue of H-1B1 visas, and people like Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy were pro-visas, and they were viewed as representing libertarianism. On the other hand, you had this traditionalist crowd. So you had Nick Fuentes saying, these are these libertarians that the technocrats, they're for open borders. So libertarianism became associated with technocracy, right? So basically Elon Musk now represented libertarianism and technocracy and open borders and kind of economic rationalism, economic determinism, technological determinism. Whereas these people were more traditionalist. They wanted to go back to closed borders, America first. And so the debate at that point in time, and this is recently, this is not very long time ago, was the state. You need a strong state which closes the border, builds a wall, and is pro-American worker. So national socialism. On the other hand, you had you had Elon Musk saying, no, we need these workers, right? And Elon Musk ended up with egg on his face because then people started noticing that most of these H-1B1 visa workers were not really these geniuses, these high-tech workers. A lot of them were just doing menial work. And then Elon Musk kind of recovered his reputation with Doge, right? And then he was stabbed back in the back by Trump, right? Who took the money that Elon Musk saved and spent it on other stuff, right? But not good stuff. I mean, just a giant military budget for Ukraine and stuff like that, right? And so this was like a roller coaster ride, the whole thing. So we are a few months since the election, and it's just a roller coaster, emotional ride, like an emotional roller coaster, right? It's like it's like you have a crazy girlfriend. Every day it's something new, and then you have in the UK similarly. And the thing is, so I was attacked by some of these Catholic types. Not Nick Fuentes is obviously too big to be responding to me, but there's another group which is these Catholics. So I got in contact with one of these guys, McGregor, and then he started responding to me, and then the blonde Rebecca, she responded to me, and they just and I was saying, well, I was sort of responding from a libertarian point of view, and then they just attacked me, and their minions, their followers, I mean, they're just really low IQ. And so the weird thing is that now you listen to Nick Fuentes, and he is sounding more and more like me. So he's like, okay, Trump promised all this stuff and none of it is happening, right? And he's starting to sound like, okay, so it doesn't matter who is in the government, right? In his latest podcast on Rumble, and I haven't figured out how to use the sharing function on this app, but he said that, well, Trump is a huge disappointment. He was supposed to be anti-war. He was supposed to be, ending the wars, and no, he's just starting new ones. He's not ending. He failed kind of to end the Ukraine war, which was supposed to take him 24 hours. He was supposed to, so he didn't really end it. He just flailed, right? He flailed, and then goes, okay, whatever. But I mean, he's still supplying Ukraine with armaments. So, as long as the U.S. keeps funding that war and sending them armaments, the war will continue. So the U.S. is responsible for that war effectively. Then the U.S. and Trump now is responsible for the thing in Gaza. And now Trump is threatening new wars in Latin America, right? In Mexico, in Venezuela. And then the whole deportation thing is kind of happening, but kind of not. And then the other huge disappointment is the failure to prosecute all the pedophiles and pedophiles associated with Jeffrey Epstein. So it turns out that all these promises were just that. They were just empty promises. And so there's this disillusion with this whole idea that all we need to do is just elect our guys. In particular, what's irking people like Nick Fuentes is the fact that Trump is in the pocket of the Israel/Jewish lobby, right? AIPAC. So that is really upsetting these people. And then he's also, of course, Trump attacked Iran. So all the no new wars, I'm going to end these wars, none of that happened. New wars are happening. Trump is in the pocket of the Israel/Jewish lobby. And then Jeffrey Epstein, none of that happened. And the deportation are kind of happening, but not really adequate. Nothing on the scale that would be satisfying when you look at the numbers. So there's disillusion. I call it the disenchantment. And then in the UK, you also see this with Carl Benjamin, aka Sargon of Akkad. He is saying the same thing because he's looking at Nigel Farage. So what Nigel Farage's part is called the reform. Is that right? And anyway, he is looking at Nigel Farage. He's looking at the people in this, they had like a conference. And he's going, this is just another iteration of Tories, right? These people are not capable. He doesn't think these, well, first of all, he thinks there's nothing really being said about immigration. So first of all, Farage is always behind, or he's always within the Overton window, and when the Overton window moves, he catches up, right? But if people move to the right of him, he attacks them. Then when the Overton window moves to the right, suddenly they're okay. So he's just basically being a typical right, conservative Tory politician. And then he's looking at these people. Sargon of Akkad, Carl Benjamin is looking at these people and going, are these people really going to do anything? And what we're seeing is disenchantment with the political process on the right. So when I was saying, you see, I was outside of the Overton window, and the problem was that I was associated with open borders. So libertarians like me, anarcho-capitalists, so right-wing libertarians, were associated with open borders because of Elon Musk and Ramaswamy, right? And it's true that some libertarians do promote open borders or don't want to talk about immigration, right? But so the idea is that only the state is capable of securing the borders. You need a strong state to secure the the borders. But the problem for this kind of traditionalist right, I still don't know what to call them, but I guess I'll call them traditionalist right. So what they want is a return to the way things were, say, in the 50s, right? The problem for them is that there aren't any political parties that are actually willing or capable of, apparently, of doing it. So Carl Benjamin is saying, well, look at these people. They get into government, and then they don't see how to operate the system, right? They're not capable of operating the system. Now, what I see here is what you might call. I'm a big fan of Scott Adams, and Scott Adams has a really great sort of way of looking at it of this kind of discussion. He uses the term cognitive dissonance. Now, I have a background in psychology. Well, I have a major in psychology. You could say I have a PhD in psychology. Anyway, I know something about psychology, and yeah, there is cognitive dissonance is a kind of a psychological take when you have a framework, when you have a set of beliefs, right? So the way to think about it is that when we ordinarily function in the world, we rely on a set of background beliefs, right? We rely on a set of background beliefs about how the world is, right? So if you think about it, say, you're in the medieval time, right? You are you've got you've got the kind of the aristocracy, the monarchy, and then you have the church, and those people had a certain framework, right? Certain beliefs about how the world is, and this framework was significantly conditioned by the church, right? By Christianity, right? That was their frame of reference. So, for example, if a king wanted to justify his rule, his power, right, his privilege, the best way was to say, well, I have my right to govern is bestowed upon me by God, right? It was called the divine right of king, something like that. Okay, and so the church and Christianity was the framework for justifying doing something. And then during Enlightenment, this framework was kind of collapsing, right? And later on, sociologists refer to this as disenchantment. They use the word disenchantment. It was, I think, Max Weber, right? Major German sociologists. It's called Entzaberung, disenchantment, the stripping away of magical, sacred explanations. Okay, so statism. Anyway, I want to develop this kind of analogy with this idea of disenchantment. So in medieval times, you had the church was very powerful. Now, one reason, to my mind, why for the power of the church is things like literacy. So the church, right? You had these monks, and the reason the church became really rich and powerful is because these monks copied books, and they had libraries, and they kind of had a monopoly on literacy and knowledge. And then what happened, and I was just looking at an article on Substack. It's the title is "The Class of 2026. AI is doing to the universities what Gutenberg did to the monasteries." So the author is John Carter, and what John Carter is arguing is that the Gutenberg press democratized books and literacy and education. And so that the church lost its monopoly. And so that you had the Protestant Reformation, right, where everyone could read the Bible and then interpret it for themselves. Previously, like the church, most people couldn't read, so they had to basically take the church's word for it, that's what is said in the Bible. But now people could read it and then interpret it for themselves. And so so then Enlightenment emerged as part of that democratization of knowledge. And this undermined the belief in a lot of the religious beliefs. People started, questioning things, right? And so you had gradual demystification of the world. You had gradual disenchantment, right? And so Enlightenment then brought about democracy, right? Because if people believe that, in the divine right of kings, then that was kind of how you legitimate this social structure. But once you start questioning that, once you start questioning the divine right of kings, then you lose the legitimating force of that. People want to know why you have the social system, the social hierarchy that you have. And so that precipitated the move toward democracy, where you had elected governments, right? And legitimacy was bestowed on the ruling class through democratic elections. So you had the divine right of kings, and then that legitimating force was lost because of Enlightenment, of spread of education and questioning, right? And so you needed democracy to kind of provide an alternative way of legitimating political power and social hierarchy. Democracy, is based around things like meritocracy, human rights, all of that kind of stuff. And then, with democracy came the nation state and the building of kind of this national construct, the nation state, right? The nation state, the flags, anthems, and effectively what you see is the state replaces the church, right? So the church was providing education. Now the state provides education. The church provided health services, mental health services. Now the state provides those. The church provided welfare. Now the state does that. Basically, the state took over all the functions of the church, and even to the point of even taking over the kind of spiritual function, where it's kind of a religion of the state. So people feel inspired by nationhood and by the state. So previously people were inspired by Christianity, by the church. They were fighting for Christianity. Europeans weren't fighting for their country. They were fighting for the church. It seems to me, I mean, when you look at it, it was the Christians who were, the Spaniards. Okay, they had allegiance to the Spanish king, but mainly I think they saw themselves as Christians when they were going out into the world, right? Whereas wars within Europe were mainly wars between monarchs, but a lot of these monarchs were not representing the nation. Like you look at the monarchs, and it's like they weren't really of the same ethnicity as the people they were ruling. I mean, the Austro-Hungarian Empire is the clearest example of this multi-ethnic state, but they were virtually all like that, with the exception of perhaps France. And France became kind of a model for the nation state, and then Germany and Italy copied that, and they unified. But prior to the 19th century, the mid-19th century, none of that existed. You had some states that were multi-ethnic, like the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and then you had other ethnicities that were divided among many states, like Germany and Italy. And then you had other peoples, like Poles. We had a big empire, multi-ethnic empire for a certain period of a few hundred years, and then it just disappeared, right? Taken over by Russia, Prussia, and Austro-Hungarian Empire. That was the norm, right? So that's a normal situation in Europe. So the nation state idea was actually really bad in that it brought about two world wars, because when Christians now identify along their ethnic lines for the purpose of spiritual fervor or whatever, they start fighting. Okay, well, now we are English and they are the Germans, right? It's not that we're Christian and we're European and they're Christian and European. It changed this whole idea of liberty, fraternity, equality, these democratic ideals. They brought about this idea of this kind of leveled nation state, right? We're all equal and we're all English or we're all French, right? And so the state becomes a kind of quasi-religious institution. And you can see this because people can't think outside of the state. Like if you say, well, I'm an anarchist, I don't believe in a state, it just doesn't fit into their head how you can get rid of the state. I think I had that problem too. I've always been skeptical of the state. I'm not sure why, but like growing up in Soviet communist Poland in the 70s, there was always a negative view of the state. And we always felt that the state basically is oppressive. And then when you look at the history, it doesn't really make any sense that somehow you have this thing, which is the state, and you can't really question it. It's like it's all powerful and flag, And then I I was more aware of the differences between myself and the other poles than of the similarities. In Europe, there's a much stronger sense of social class. So this idea that somehow your whole identity is just defined by this one thing, your ethnic background, right? And your national identity is just, it's very strange. And so obviously it's complicated because, for example, in Germany, there are Catholic Germans and there are Protestant Germans. And I noticed, for example, early on that there is a huge difference between that part of Europe, which is more Protestant, and that part of Europe, which has been Catholic, right? And that I can relate much better to Europeans who are Catholic than to Europeans who are from the Protestant parts of Europe. And there are countries like Germany, which are divided in the middle between being Catholic and being Protestant. So it's a very complicated picture. So this idea that somehow the nation state is this one thing that defines us, and that somehow we can't really do anything without it. Everything is, and then when you travel, you realize there's a lot of countries where the state doesn't really provide very much at all. It's kind of anarchy. Most of Southeast Asia is fairly anarchic. I mean, it's becoming more and more tyrannical because the government, the thing is that, let's say if you travel to Southeast Asia in the 90s, you didn't have the internet, you didn't have cell phones, internet banking, right? You just didn't feel the government at all. There was no government anywhere. But now, because of technology, so for example, I heard that in Vietnam, they're debanking people and they're instituting all these rules to do with banking. And they can only do that because everyone now has a cell phone and has to use electronic banking more and more, right? So that means that even in these countries where it used to be like you don't see the government, now the government is starting to impose itself. So technology can turn places that are fairly anarchic because the state doesn't have enough money to control everything the way it does in Western countries. But now it can use your cell phone to debank you and stuff like that. But in countries like Australia, people cannot think outside of the state. They don't even know enough history to know, like, listen, Australia didn't exist prior to 1900 as a country. It was just separate colonies, right? It's like you talk about 19th century, how Australians, blah, blah. Australia was not a country in the 19th century. I mean, I don't want to lecture people because I'm a migrant, and I mean, it's not really my country, especially now, right? I don't know what it is. I don't know whose country it is. I think it doesn't really have an identity. Increasingly, its identity, whatever identity it did have, which was never really strong. I mean, in people's minds, it's strong, but if you look at it anthropologically, because this is the thing, is these concepts, ethnicity, identity, culture, they're anthropological concepts, and you have to study some anthropology to understand what is culture. And people go, well, Australian culture is blah, blah, blah. And you go, no, you don't need, this is a very, it ends up being culture is whatever Australian people do. So if Australians have barbecues on the weekend, somehow that's culture. It's a very thin concept of culture, right? It's not really how Europeans use the word culture. And this is the difference between the new world and the old world, is that in the old world, we have a very thick concept of culture that goes back much further, okay? and it consists of more significant things. So from a European point of view, the culture here is really the British culture. Because if you go, well, what would you be teaching kids at school? Well, you'd be teaching Shakespeare and, British history and British literature and that kind of stuff, right? So the English identity was constructed by, the parliamentary system, the political system, the common law. But Australians don't really know any of this stuff. One of the politicians here, what's his name, Anderson, he goes, Australian identity is defined by the common law, blah, blah, blah. But, well, he mentioned the common law, which is nice. Well, that's British. But Australia is not common. It's not the common law. You know what I mean? In theory, it's supposed to be the common law, but in practice, it's not. Because, for example, now you can be arrested for being offensive. How is that the common law? I mean, in the UK, they don't have the common law. I mean, I don't think that is operational anymore. I mean, they just built something on top of it which has nothing to do with the common law. I just had this idea today that what do they teach in schools? Because Scott Adams mentioned that in some state in the US, they're putting through new legislation that if people do homeschooling, they have to teach particular things. So obviously things like, diversity, equity, inclusion, LGBT, all that kind of stuff. And Scott Adams was laughing that because people don't want this government schooling. And so my thought was, well, what do the government schools teach? What they teach is government, right? Because they're government schools, so they teach government. Oh, because, well, they teach economics. Yeah, but what they teach is economics according to the government economics, right? So they're not going to teach free market economics. They're not going to teach Austrian economics. They're going to teach how the government manages the economy and how the government creates everything effectively, right? And why you have to be regulated. Like, you can't just sell stuff on the free market. You have to get permission, right? So, for example, now I have the skill, I give to the gab, and I'm providing my skill on YouTube. Well, as I understand it, in December, there will be this new legislation will come into effect where I'm going to have to provide my my info, my ID and my information in order to access social media. So the Australian government is going to regulate my ability to live stream or upload videos to YouTube. And if I say something that the Australian government doesn't like, they have my information, and then they can come to my door and say, you're teaching free market economics, you're teaching anarchism, you're teaching anti-state philosophy. So now you are going to be debanked. We're gonna punish you, right? Or you're gonna lose your access to YouTube. Or we're gonna punish you in some way. So this is the thing is why is this happening? So this is what we're gonna get into. We're gonna get into why I think this is happening. So the nation state has become a kind of a religion. So the nation state has taken over the church. So the schools and all these national emblems and the history, the whole thing is a social construct, right? It's been constructed. It's not a reality. It's a system of belief, okay, that is inculcated in people to the point where they can't think outside of it. Like, literally, they're incapable of thinking outside of it. But what happens is when you have the system of belief, where they, like, So in medieval times, people believed certain things, and then there were certain facts that contradicted that. So they, for example, they believed that the Earth is in the center of the universe. And now you had astronomers looking at, Copernicus, Galileo, right? And they were going, no, actually the Earth revolves around the sun. Now, so now you have factual evidence that contradicts your system of beliefs. And this creates cognitive dissonance. And the initial reaction is resistance, right? No. We have to, our system of beliefs cannot be upset, okay? We need to maintain the system of belief. And so you will have rationalization. But eventually, the volume of evidence becomes overwhelming, and you are now facing having to adjust your system of beliefs to the new data. And so initially, there are two situations. One is that your system of beliefs is maintained, but you sort of, you adapt it. But at some point, there may be so many of your beliefs become undermined by the incoming evidence that the whole thing just collapses. And then you have to construct a new system of beliefs. And I think that's what's happened in Europe, that the whole system of beliefs became undermined, and then you had an alternative system of beliefs, which is democracy. Democracy became the new religion, effectively. And so what we are living in is in a kind of a secular religion, you could say. People identify as Catholic. I mean, I identify as Catholic culturally, right? But I don't really have any use for the Catholic Church. I mean, other than, it's spiritual, you go to church. But the church doesn't really have any role in my life. I mean, I was considering getting a job in a Catholic school, and then I looked at how these Catholic schools here in Australia advertise themselves, and they're basically woke. Catholicism in Australia is meaningless. It's feminist, it's woke, it's a basically quasi-governmental institution. They're basically, they're into diversity. Okay, they're not into the LGBT, but they're feminist, basically. When you look at how they promote themselves, it's all women, right? So women, minorities, so all the same stuff. Okay, they don't go as far as LGBT, although who knows? I've seen some recent stuff that there's some LGBT stuff in the Vatican. I mean, I don't even pay attention to it. It's so depressing, right? So Catholicism, it just becomes a kind of a cultural identity, which means something like traditionalism, belief in traditional values. I don't feel that it really has any significance outside of something like taste. So, Catholic aesthetics, traditional architecture, but you can't really say anything against all the perversion. In Europe, it's more, in Poland, for example, it's more significant, right? Because people actually act on their Catholicism. They stand on the street and they protest against abortion and stuff like that. But then you have counter protests. So it's even, right? But here it's meaningless. Catholics won't do anything. All they say is, well, I guess if you send your child to Catholic school, they won't have pornography there. So it's safer. So basically Catholics are marketing, not grooming your child into homosexuality or other perverted stuff and having pornography in the library. But other than that, they're still feminist, diversity, all that stuff, right? So the church what I'm saying, I guess the point there is that the church becomes subordinate to the state. The state is the papacy, the democratic church, the church of democracy, is the real papacy. So if you think about it, there was the Pope and then there were the kings, and the kings were subordinate to the Pope. But now the Pope is subordinate to the democratic global homo system, right? It has no power. It seems to be completely demoralized and disempowered. But now what's happening, like I don't hold out for the Catholic Church or stuff like that. But what's happening, what I am holding out for, I'm kind of a technological determinist. So the Gutenberg press was a technological innovation that reduced the power of the church and increased the power of the state. But eventually it even reduced the power of the monarchs, and it led to, enlightenment and then the nation state and democracy. But I think now democracy is suffering the same fate as the church and then the monarchs. In other words, it's facing a legitimacy crisis. Where was the source of legitimacy of the modern democracy? My argument is that the bourgeois kind of capitalist system showed that when you have economies of scale, you get incredible increase in efficiency and productivity. So large enterprises have incredible economies of scale. So we're talking about exponential increase in productivity. And then the state effectively becomes like the biggest enterprise, right? So these capitalist enterprises functioned because they had these bureaucratic systems, so that they could produce large number of something like cars or whatever. And then they developed these bureaucratic systems, accounting departments, marketing departments, the thing that produces, right, the factory or the manufacturing plant or the oil rig or the farm, right, or the transportation, trucks. So the thing that actually does the production, but then you need an army of bureaucrats. You need accountants, you need marketers, you need managers, you need HR people, right? And so the state evolved as like this super enterprise, right? So it has banking, this is accounting department, right? The production thing, what does it produce? Well, it produces legislation, right? So you had common law, which was the thing that like resolve disputes. But now what the government does, what it manufactures is legislation. And legislation is the production thing. In other words, look, things are good because we have all these rules, right? There's a rule for everything. And that's the value of government, according to the government. So people who are brainwashed into this religion believe, like if you say, they will complain about inflation, they will complain about unemployment, but they will never complain about regulations. Well, you need the regulations, you see. There is a religious belief that without regulations, the world would collapse. Like third world countries are poor because they lack regulations. This is the belief of the devotee of the statist religion, that regulations, the things that when you see a parliament, when they speak, when they debate something, what they're debating is another regulation. And they will just pile on more regulations. So everything is regulated. And then when you say, well, why do you need this regulation? And the magic word is because. It's because. And whatever comes after because, what they discovered is that this is research in like persuasion, psychology of persuasion. If you say because, it doesn't matter what you say after because. As long as there's a because and then some blah, 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 people just tune out. They hear the word because and they go, oh, yes, I see. Got it. Okay, there is a because. I thought there's no because. Unless someone uttered the word because, I thought this regulation is unnecessary. But someone said because, I heard because, heard that word hit my eardrum, and now I am convinced, okay, I get it. This idea that there's a reason, well, there's a rationalization. Okay, oh, there's a rationalization. Okay, good. That's as good as a reason. And so the state kind of had a monopoly on the because it has a marketing department, which is the media and schooling, right? So once it got a hold of the media and schooling, which say because blah blah blah, then everything, then they can do anything, right? And so they just manufacture regulations. It's a product. Okay, so they regulate all the other enterprises. So it's a meta enterprise. They also produce money, right? So which means they devalue money, but they provide it. They have a monopoly on providing money. So they have these monopolies, right? Then the other one is security, because when you have these regulations, you have to enforce them. So you have to have monopoly on security, right? You can't allow people to provide their own security. Because then if you have a rule, some random rule, arbitrary rule, and then people do something and then they have their own security, and then your enforcement comes in, they have to confront their security, right? That makes things difficult. Let's just monopolize security. So it's kind of a church and a business at the same time. Okay. The legitimacy comes from the economies of scale. It means they can control a very large area, and so they can master a lot of resources and do stuff. The problem is none of that is really of value to the population as such, right? When you look at the things that this giant corporation can do, let's say they go, okay, we're gonna produce regulations, we're gonna produce roads, and for these people, none of that is really all that interesting, right? And people start questioning, why does the government have to produce these things? I mean, at some point, you're starting to question, because you can see that, and this is a Hoppean point, that whenever you have a monopoly on something, the quality of that thing is reduced. Okay, it's just a kind of economic law that whenever someone has a monopoly, the quality of that thing is reduced. Competition increases quality, right? It forces the provider to increase quality, because they have to compete for the customer. But when you have a monopoly, this always reduces quality. And so people start noticing that the state has all these monopolies. So they have a monopoly on education, and the quality of the education is just tangibly, visibly falling, right? People are becoming less educated. Then you have policing, that, right? You have all these monopolies, and the quality is falling. And so the state has to kind of justify and find a way of legitimating its monopoly, right? And the main source, I mean, other than providing this stuff, right, which they do less and less, the main source of legitimacy is the democratic process. The problem is that people start voting, right? People start voting in a way that the politicians don't really want people to vote, right? You get this kind of populism. So there's effort, there's incentive to try to manage the democratic process, right? So, you have populism, people vote for Trump, the politicians and the whole system isn't really happy with that, so they then try to manage Trump. And so then people notice, well, actually the democratic process doesn't make any difference. It's always the same. No matter who you vote for, it's always the same. And so this now creates cognitive dissonance. Just as you had cognitive dissonance earlier when people were believed in the church, and now you had the Gutenberg press, and more and more information was coming in, and this upset the whole system of belief, and eventually the whole thing just crashed down. You're seeing something very similar happening now, where people are, things like X, right? And these kinds of platforms are providing an alternative perspective on an alternative source of information. And people are starting to do things like homeschooling, and now you're starting getting AI. So what the AI means effectively is that you have unlimited access to information. Information effectively becomes a commodity. It becomes universally accessible. And the other thing is that the state, was regulating things, and it was kind of solving a certain problem, which is the problem of transaction cost, right? So if you don't have rules across the board, then when you go somewhere, you don't know what the rules are. So moving between local jurisdictions created a lot of friction, a lot of problems, right? But now you have these platforms, right? You have these massive platforms. So for example, I started using Airbnb. And I had problems, so Airbnb, you find a room somewhere, you're traveling, like say, I was traveling to Spain, and you go on Airbnb, the website, and you go, okay, I'm gonna be in Madrid or whatever city location, and you look at what's available, and you find something that's at your price point and at the quality that's acceptable to you in an area that is interesting, right? And then you book that for say a week, right? It can be a room, it can be a whole apartment, and so I started using that because I noticed that it's actually, in terms of, I can get a room or even a small apartment for a similar price as a backpacker's hostel. And I'm sacrificing location. It's not as centrally located, but I'm gaining privacy. I don't have to deal with all the other people. And I don't really do hotels. I was always doing backpackers, but I found backpackers, the quality of experience in backpackers hostels has really gone down. And I'm too old for backpackers anyway. So Airbnb was a really good solution for me. Now, what I found was that there were some situations where the host was problematic. They tried to scam me, they were rude or something. But I noticed that basically the rate and review system is very effective at screening that out. Right? So there's a natural selection process, because when you leave people low a negative review, that hits their hip pocket, and they they suffer financially for it. And so I found that actually the Airbnb experience is pretty consistent. And then the quality, the good hosts, they were because they were getting consistently good reviews, they became super hosts. So they could charge a bit more, but you had fairly, you had, the security that the experience is going to be okay, because they're providing consistently good quality experience for the guests, and they're getting positive reviews. So the system, the review system, the quality experience is built into the system. And I was thinking, the thing is, this makes governments completely redundant, because you can build that for anything. I mean, you can build it, obviously, you have Amazon, you have eBay. Like in China, I was living in China for like a decade. And when I went there first in 2014, when I said, well, I want to buy something online, and then the standard thing was, there's a lot of scams on. So their version of Amazon is Taobao, right? You buy everything on Taobao. It's not the only one, but that's like the biggest one. And they, everyone was saying in 2014, there's so many, everything is fake on Taobao, there's so many scams. And I said, well, but there's a rate and review system, and why, like if something is fake or poor quality for the price, you can just leave them a negative review. And people just looked at me, like the locals, the Chinese were looking at me like, no, I don't trust that. But within a couple of years, everyone was very happy with Taobao because of that. And Taobao cleaned up a lot of scams. But basically, the rate and review system sorted out all the scammers and low quality providers. And the stuff on Taobao that you buy for the price is very, very good. Right? Now, this was relative to my salary. So for me, stuff on Taobao was cheap and good quality, like really value for money. Maybe for the typical Chinese person, it's not cheap, right? Because I had a university job, I had, a good income. But my point is that these systems are incredibly effective at managing very large, millions of transactions. Why can't you just organize the government like with that? Why do you need a bunch of low IQ liars debating something like it's still the 19th century in some very nicely fitted out room with leather seats? They're like giving all these speeches. It's all meaningless. People just want functioning, well-built cities, right? Safe. They want things to work, right? When I go to, say, Rome or Istanbul or Warsaw, right? I want to find a room, and I want some guarantee that the experience, I'm paying for it, is going to be a positive experience. Why is that so different than, for example, having a safe neighborhood, right? When people, you see, and so the idea is that this process of voting is that feedback system. But the difference is that I buy the product. Like I just had an experience just today that really demonstrates how it works, right? When you have a private enterprise, because I bought something on Amazon, and there's a locker, right? Like one of those locker boxes. You go there, you scan, you get an email with a barcode, and you scan that, and the locker opens, and you pick up, right? And I opened the box, took out my got some earphones, right? A cable, USB cable. And it's a like one package was cardboard and the other one was plastic. And I look and there's these two big bins. It says cardboard and plastic. So I dispose of the packages into those bins, right? Because the locker, I think it's called a locker, right? I guess, is next to some kind of a delivery company or a storage company. So they have these big bins with like, it looks like there's some paper, like cardboard boxes, some styrofoam stuff, and just random stuff. I'm like, okay, well, I'm just gonna, and it says cardboard and plastic. This is cardboard and plastic. And the guy comes out and starts berating me, saying that this is for cardboard only. And just starts berating me loudly, just starts shouting at me. And I'm like, it says cardboard and plastic on the thing. And I walked away. I wasn't gonna and get in. I was already leaving when he came, but he just started shouting at me. So I search and I go, okay, so what's the best way of reporting this to Amazon? And it turns out it's on X, right? So I just made a post, right, on X. And I just said, I described the situation. Immediately they got back to me and sent me to a form where I can report this. And I filled it out. I said, look, I don't want to have a situation where there's some company next to the locker box. Presumably, Amazon is paying this company to have the locker box there. There are two large bins. It says plastic and cardboard and plastic in big letters. Why am I getting verbally assaulted for disposing of the package into those bins by an employee of this company? And I wrote that and said, yeah, okay, we'll get back to you. I mean, this is how the business is very sensitive to this kind of stuff. And somehow this pseudo-democratic process of voting once every few years is supposed to be the equivalent of that. Okay? And I think people are starting to notice, even on the right wing, the political right wing, people like Nick Fuentes, that the democratic process is completely fake, right? It's a farce. It doesn't do what they believe it does. And I'm really seeing Carl Benjamin turning libertarian. Like, I'm really hearing that libertarian vibe. Like, he's looking at these people, these politicians in the Reform Party, which is supposed to be the revolutionary Nigel Farage party that's going to deport them all. And he's going, nah, they're not going to do it. No way. I look at them, I'm like, these people are going to, they look like a bunch of wet Tories, right? And then he says other stuff. He's got another video where he goes, well, that these people, so he's trying to read their mind. He's saying, well, these people are worried about falling birth rates, but he thinks it's not a problem. But this idea that these people are motivated by some reasoning process that they need the migrants because, so for example, here in Australia, like, they're trying to read their minds why Labor is allowing all these Indians in, and the idea is, well, because they vote for Labor, and that's probably part. I mean, look, none of that is false, but it's kind of, it doesn't really get to the bottom of it, because you have to ask, well, what is the underlying kind of dynamic going on there? And I think the Hoppean perspective on this is that, like, people's idea of politicians was like way back when politicians seemed to actually care about the country. Like, so in terms of an Austrian economic analysis, the idea is that some people have high time preference and some people have low time preference, right? So the idea is when you have children, you care about their future, you have low time preference. You're willing to sacrifice the present for future benefit. And actually Elon Musk tweeted a video, one of those whiteboard videos by Scott Adams, where Scott Adams goes, well, how do you deal with laziness? Well, you just stop thinking about the cost of the labor, of the work, the effort, and start thinking about the trade-off in the future. So refocus to the future benefit of doing something. Effectively, what Scott Adams is arguing is how to mentally switch from a high time preference, my pleasure now, I don't want to just put in the effort, I just want to enjoy now, to low time preference, where I will have less enjoyment now and more enjoyment later. It's the same thing. And so people have still been working with this image of politicians as having low time preference, people who plan ahead. So this idea is that these politicians, they're worried about the falling birth rates and they're planning ahead, right? They're making the sacrifice for the benefit of the future because Western countries have falling birth rates. But I think that's, you see, that's wrong, right? And what about the labor? This idea that labor is allowing all these Indians in order to have more voters. That's more accurate because it seems that I don't know about in the past, but perhaps definitely today, these politicians, the problem with them is that they appear to have high time preference. In other words, they're not really people who are incentivized to make sacrifices in the present for the benefit of the future, in particular for the benefit of their people, right? So the idea is, okay, you have the nation state, and then Nigel Farage, he's a Brit, and he's going to make sacrifices for the Brits. Okay, and there's a problem with that argument. And actually, okay, I need to go back to my notes. So yeah, so what Carl Benjamin is noticing is that these politicians appear stupid. They appear dumb. And then people try to rationalize that they're like here in Australia, these politicians are incentivized by votes, right? So Indians vote Labour, as if the Liberal Party, and then there's a schism in the Liberal Party because some people, like some of them also want the Indian vote. So it's not clear whether they are rational or stupid. I think the question is more, what are the incentives, right? Are they incentivized to have a high time preference or low time preference? Because one way to look at it is that religion, one thing about religion that changed when you started getting democracy is that religion tends to promote low time preference. You're always thinking about the future, sacrificing the now for the future, okay? And democracy, and also the monarchy, because the king was kind of like the de facto owner of the country, was his property, if you own something, you tend to try not to destroy it because you will lose your property, right? You try to maintain your property. So there is a built-in incentive of low time preference. You don't want to just use up the property and then in the future you're left with nothing, right? So as long as you're psychologically capable of thinking ahead, because that's also a factor, right? Some people are not psychologically capable, right? There are differences, and some people act impulsively without thinking about the consequences, right? But if you have a population, right, that is psychologically capable of thinking, planning ahead, then the built-in incentive structure is, if you have something, right, you try to maintain it and not use it up. But when you have a democratic system, because of the short voting, election cycles, the built-in time preference is now high time preference, right? So politicians are incentivized to promise things, to give things away, right? Well, to provide welfare, provide things, solve problems. That's the built-in incentive structure in the democratic system. Like short-term promises, right? Spending, importing voters, media sound bites, right? Whereas low time preference behavior among politicians is punished. Those politicians lose elections. So you see, it's the opposite of the Airbnb. The natural selection system in politics is to promote people with a high time preference, whereas people with low time preference get screened out. So it's built into the system. It's not whether they're dumb. They're not dumb if if Albanese or Starmer or whatever these people, become prime minister. Well, that's hardly because they're dumb. They're obviously intelligent enough to win elections and become prime minister. They're dumb only if you think that they actually want to stop the mass immigration or stop the boats. If you actually think they're incentivized to do it, if only they knew how, if only they could have enough brain cells firing to do it. But the thing is, if it was a matter of life and death, so that if they don't stop the boats, it's gonna be the guillotine. They would figure it out, right? Even with their low IQ and few brain cells firing, they would get those brain cells firing so much that they would figure it out. The problem is that they're not really incentivized. I mean, that's alternative perspective on that. The irrationality is rather on the people like Carl Benjamin, and I guess he's got the cognitive dissonance going, and now but the irrationality is to believe. Well, it's like you make a mistake, but you keep making the mistake. So the definition of insanity is to keep making the same mistake over and over, right? So where is the irrationality? Is it with the politicians, or is it with people who believe that politicians actually, that if you just get our guy in, he will, if we just got Hitler in, he would solve the problem. right? So the low time preference behavior is punished in politics. And so, the modern politicians look incompetent because when actually just optimizing their short-term payoff. They're behaving rationally given the incentive structure of the democratic political system. And I think Carl Benjamin and Nick Fuentes it's dawning on them. And this is the disenchantment. The facts are coming in fast. The disillusionment, right? To the point where Carl Benjamin, he's even looking at Nigel Farage, who is not even elected yet, but looks like being elected, and going, I don't think it's gonna change anything. He's no longer saying, yeah, if our guy Nigel gets in, he will fix it. He will deport them all. That's not what he's saying. He's like, I don't think this is gonna do anything. So this is the disenchantment moment. It's not the people, it's the system, right? And this is the difference between religion, right? Religion gave people, kind of inculcated this low time preference. You make the sacrifices. And so Europe was built on sacrifices, right? What we enjoy today, the great architecture, the culture, that was just generations of people making sacrifices and having a low time preference. But what democracy is doing is the opposite of that. Everything is becoming cheap and low quality, and everything is becoming shit because people are no longer willing to make sacrifices because they have no religion. Everyone is cynical, and the politics, right? This is supposed to be the church of democracy, is promoting that. You see the politicians being cynical, people vote cynically, and people behave cynically in everyday life. So what you get is what Hans Hermann Hoppe called decivilization, right? Degradation of culture. Even if a low time preference politician emerges, like Thomas Massey in the US, they will lose to high time preference competitors, right? So we are looking at a second kind of disenchantment, right, in the West. The first was the disenchantment with the church, with the religious system of belief. That was replaced by democracy. Democracy became the new religion. And now we are facing the second disenchantment. And it's really this notion of time preference is an extremely powerful explanatory tool, I think, to understand what's actually going on. It's a very useful way of thinking about, like why do politicians behave as they do? I think the problem was, that for libertarians, the election of Trump and then Elon Musk coming in was kind of both a high point and a low point for libertarians, because Elon Musk is a libertarian. Okay, we are in power now. He's gonna cut down the American government, and then you had Milei in Argentina. So libertarianism became kind of a high-profile position. So before that, libertarianism was like something very marginal. And now suddenly we're in the center. But the problem is that for the nationalists, libertarianism then became associated with the H1B1 visa open border system and corporatism and these companies bringing in Indians to replace American workers and that kind of stuff, right? The right wingers, they had this strongman image that if we only get, the strongman in, he will close the borders and then deport them all, and then American workers can have, and then, put up tariffs, right? Now, the interesting thing is that Trump is putting up tariffs, which libertarians are against, because the libertarian argument is that the problem isn't free trade. The problem is all the regulations, right? So you have Western countries being regulated up to the eyeballs. You're competing with countries where there are very low regulations, like environmental regulations, labor regulations. And so you can't compete. Putting up tariffs is not really the solution, because you're going to get lower quality products at a higher price. You're now preferring the worker and the business over the consumer. The solution is to reduce all the regulations. And so Trump put up all these tariffs, but the right wingers are not like jumping out. Yeah, tariffs. We have tariffs. Will solve everything. I mean, Trump is doing exactly what they want. He's bringing all these companies. So like he brought in Zuckerberg. How much money? Hey, Mark, how much money are you going to invest in the U.S.? $600 billion. And then Mark Zuckerberg goes, like he thinks, he doesn't know he's on a hot mic. He goes, sorry, Mr. President, I didn't know what number you wanted to go with. What number did you want? Like, was 600 billion okay? I mean, it just shows. I mean, it's such a great demonstration of how the whole political thing is a kabuki theater, right? It's all a kabuki theater, and Trump is a very good marketer, and he's very good at this kabuki theater. But that's what they wanted. They wanted, the right wing. They wanted tariffs, right? So if as a libertarian, I would argue, no, you need free trade. Oh, you're like Elon Musk. You're economic determinant. We need to close down, and in particular, academic agent was giving all these arguments against free trade, against because the argument for free trade is I forgot. Again, dyslexia. It'll come back to me. The argument is that different countries have comparative advantage, right? The argument is that different countries have a different comparative advantage, right? This country is better at producing X, and this country is better at producing Y, and it's better for them to specialize. And an academic agent was arguing that argument doesn't really hold water, because you have free movement of capital and labor, and that's not wrong. That's not the wrong. That argument is not incorrect. It still doesn't mean that that putting up trade barriers is a solution, because you're just impoverishing both countries, right? The solution is really to reduce regulations and taxes, right? Is to open the country up to free enterprise. And so Trump is doing, the tariffs and forcing these companies to put their manufacturing back in the U.S. I don't hear anything on the right about how great that is. No, they're just complaining about other things. They're complaining about the wars and the Israeli thing and the immigration. I mean, I can see the argument against the H1B1 visas, that just allowing these people to fly in and take jobs is problematic, even if you're a libertarian. But that's kind of reducing libertarianism to one issue, which can be debated. If you just allow everybody to come in and give them welfare, well, libertarian theory does not really promote welfare. And so now, that's the other thing about Carl Benjamin, is now he seems to be anti-welfare. So he made a video on the falling birth rates, and he goes, how to solve falling birth rates? Get rid of welfare. Carl Benjamin is turning into an anarcho-capitalist. Like, I don't know whether I had anything to do with it, but it just, and Nick Fuentes is slightly behind. But I think everyone is recognizing that all these problems with the family, the falling birth rates, single, is basically women seeing the state as their man, right? They basically replaced the husband and the man with the state. It's dawning on these people that welfare is not a good thing. But that's a libertarian position. And once you get rid of welfare, that's a huge driver of, I mean, how many of these boat people would come on these boats and risk, life and limb if they didn't think that they're going to land, get put in a hotel, given food, given a phone, and given a scooter to earn money as a Deliveroo drivers? Get rid of all of that. People are realizing that the fundamental problem is the state, that the state is the problem and not the solution. And they don't understand why, right? Because they, and this is what we need to do here on this channel, is we need to provide Hoppean analysis to the right-wingers to explain to them why, like, their head is, like, why? I can see that no matter who we elect, it's always the same problem, but we don't understand why. But I think they're starting to see. I think Carl Benjamin has some good advice from some of his cohorts at the Lotus Eaters. Some of them are libertarians, and they're starting to explain to him the mechanics of economics and incentives and time preference, so that he's starting to understand why this is happening. That it's right. Nick Fuentes is also at the point of, like, he was like, Trump, MAGA, we get our guy in and he's gonna do it, and he's not doing it. Why? The real problem case is E. Michael Jones, the Catholic commentator, because he is economically ignorant. So he's really good on cultural issues, but he just doesn't understand economics. And he thinks that the free market is the source of the problem, right? And what you need is social credit. Not like in China, but social credit as in you need the government to provide loan. Again, it's like if we only had the right people in charge, like Catholics, who would provide social credit, everything would be solved. And he's citing, and obviously, so he's citing, I think he's looking at like German economists. And so this is the thing, is that the big split in economics is the historical school, which is a kind of like anthropology or sociology. So it's saying that, economics is kind of local and cultural. And then you had the Austrian school, which believes in universal economic laws. And so people like E. Michael Jones and some of these Catholics and nationalists, they believe that if only our people, our nation, our ethnic cohorts were in charge, they would manage the economy the right way. The problem is, I mean, there are plenty of examples of countries like Argentina, but Argentina is just one of them. I mean, you have Brazil, Venezuela, all these countries that were ethnically homogeneous nation states that had strong socialist governments that are just economic basket cases. And it's always like, well, it's because the US, blah, 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 right? US imperialism is the problem, or Jewish banking, or something like that. And that, you know, again, is this kind of rationalization and cognitive dissonance that if only the right people were managing the economy, all the problems would be solved. Okay, so I think I'm done with this. I've been going on for 2 hours, and 2-hour live stream. It's my first. See if I can do a better, maybe look at some videos, look at Carl Benjamin's videos and give a closer commentary. But this has been fun, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye.